In Africa, there's a huge amount of rare earths and just a lot of resources. A lot of it's unexploited, right? And so that's going to, as I said, I think maybe 6 months ago, watch Africa, right? Because that's where it's going to be happening. And if you have a look at their stock markets, I think Nigeria's up about 40% this year. So the importance is scrambling for the raw product. So what you're seeing is this is an absolutely mad, desperate race.
For years, Washington believed Africa's story was simple, a continent rich in resources, but poor in power, a place to extract from, not to negotiate with, a supplier, not a player. But something has changed, and this time it's not a protest or a promise, it's a plan, because Africa quietly, strategically just did something that has stunned the West. It outsmarted the United States in the one arena America never thought it could lose: the global mineral war. This isn't about gold or diamonds, this is about the new oil, the minerals that will power the 21st century, lithium, cobalt, copper, graphite, rare earths, the elements that decide who builds electric cars, who controls green energy, and ultimately who rules the next industrial age. For decades, America thought it had this game locked down. But while Washington was lecturing Africa about development and democracy, Beijing, New Delhi, and now African leaders themselves were quietly rewriting the rules. It started small, a series of local deals, mines here, refineries there, a new regional corridor connecting cobalt from the Congo to ports in Tanzania and Kenya. To most observers, it looked like business as usual, but behind the scenes a quiet revolution was unfolding. Because for the first time in history, African nations are refusing to play the role of the supplier. They're becoming the processors, the owners, the traders. They're cutting out the middlemen and rewriting contracts that once gave away 80% of profits to foreign corporations. And that right there is the move Washington never saw coming. When the world started shifting to electric cars, solar grids, and battery technology, the US assumed Africa would remain dependent, exporting raw materials cheaply and importing expensive finished products. That model made sense to everyone except Africa, so countries like Namibia, Zambia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo began changing their laws. They banned the export of raw lithium and cobalt. They demanded local refining, local ownership, and African processing plants. Suddenly, what was once Africa's weakness, its resources, became its leverage. The Dark Sea and Zambia announced plans for Africa's first joint battery manufacturing zone. Namibia signed a $10 billion partnership with the European Union, but on African terms, not Western ones, and Zimbabwe stunned everyone when it said no more raw lithium exports, only finished products. That one move sent shockwaves through global markets, because Zimbabwe holds some of the world's largest lithium reserves, and lithium is the heart of every electric battery on Earth. In Washington, policymakers called it economic nationalism, but in Africa, people called it something else. Finally learning the game, for decades, Western companies dug the minerals, shipped them out, and sold them back as finished goods at 100 times the profit. But Africa's new generation of leaders, from Lusaka to Nairobi to Harare, aren't interested in being part of that system anymore. They're not asking for charity, they're demanding partnership. This is where the game flipped, because while Washington was focused on competing with China for African influence, Africa was quietly building alliances with India, Indonesia, the Way, and Brazil, countries outside the traditional Western sphere. These new alliances aren't about aid, they're about capacity, technology transfers, factory building, and shared ownership. India's engineers are helping set up new battery plants in Tanzania. Chinese companies are building refineries, not just mines, and African universities are partnering with global institutes to train the next generation of geologists, data scientists, and mineral economists. The goal is simple: no more exporting raw potential. Washington didn't expect that. For years, U.S. policy toward Africa revolved around stability, keeping things predictable, keeping them manageable. But the rise of BRICS and Africa's entry into a multipolar world shattered that predictability. Now, Washington finds itself watching as Africa signs billion-dollar deals without using the US dollar, without US approval, and sometimes without US involvement at all. And that's where the panic begins. In 2024, when the US State Department released its new critical minerals strategy, it quietly admitted something astonishing: that Africa holds over 30% of the world's mineral reserves essential for clean energy, and the US controls less than 2% of them. The rest? Controlled by African governments and their new partners in Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America. In short, Africa now holds the keys to the next energy revolution, and Washington is knocking on the door it used to own. But here's the twist no one talks about. Africa didn't steal America's dominance, it outsmarted it through strategy, timing, and unity. When the world was distracted by global politics, African leaders were aligning policies, pooling resources, and investing in logistics networks, from the Lobito Corridor to the Trans-African Railway. These aren't random projects. They're arteries designed to move African resources across African soil, refined in African factories, and exported under African flags. That's not dependency, that's independence reborn through economics. And so, Washington's once comfortable grip on global supply chains is slipping, because you can't build an electric car, a phone, or even a missile without Africa's minerals. And if Africa controls those minerals, Africa controls the future. That's the real war, not with guns or borders, but with contracts, commodities, and currency. Today, as U.S. officials rush to sign new mining deals, they're discovering something else. Africa's no longer desperate. It's deliberate, it knows its value, and it's negotiating like it. The leverage has flipped. For once, it's the West making the offers and Africa choosing which to accept. This isn't just a policy change, it's a psychological shift. A continent once defined by extraction is now defining extraction itself. A continent, once dismissed as a supplier, is now shaping global strategy. For Washington, this is more than an economic setback. It's a geopolitical earthquake, because control over minerals isn't just about wealth, it's about who writes the next chapter of history. And if Africa continues this trajectory, industrializing, refining, exporting on its own terms, then the age of Western monopoly over African resources will finally end. So when headlines say, the US is losing Africa, they miss the point. The truth is Africa isn't being lost, it's being found by its own people. By its own power, by its own purpose. This isn't a rebellion, it's a realization. Africa isn't breaking away, it's breaking free. And in the global mineral war, it just played the smartest move of all. When Washington realized it was losing grip on Africa's mineral map, it went searching for answers. How did this happen? Who made the deals? And most importantly, who's really behind this quiet revolution? Because what looked like a few trade agreements on paper was, in truth, a continent-wide strategy, one that began in private rooms, away from cameras, between African leaders who were tired of the old script. It started with a whisper in 2022. The African Union's Economic Transformation Task Force held a confidential series of meetings in Addis Ababa. Their goal wasn't aid or debt relief, it was control. Control over Africa's mineral wealth, not by outsiders, but by Africans themselves. From that meeting came a phrase that would reshape Africa's economic direction: no more raw exports, no more lost value. That phrase became policy in more than a dozen African countries within just 2 years. Zambia and the Democratic Republic of Congo, two neighbors once competing for investors, joined forces to build Africa's first battery manufacturing hub. The message was simple: we will not dig and sell, we will dig, process, and profit. The United States tried to re-enter the game. Washington offered technical assistance through its Minerals Security Partnership, but Africa had already moved on. Instead, Zambia turned to India for engineering support, the DRC partnered with China for refining technology, and both countries invited South Korea and the way to finance infrastructure. The result? A multi-billion-dollar supply chain with zero U.S. involvement. Washington didn't see it coming because it still viewed Africa through a 1990 seconds lens as a place to provide aid, not to compete in. But Africa's new generation of leaders had no interest in dependency. They wanted leverage, and that leverage came through the mineral deals the world wasn't meant to notice. In early 2024, Namibia quietly signed a $10 billion green hydrogen deal with India, one that included rare earth mineral rights for battery production. For years, the US had dominated this space through European intermediaries, but this time, Washington wasn't even invited to the table. Why? Because Namibia didn't want another lecture on governance, it wanted technology, and India was offering it without the political strings. That deal positioned India as a new player in Africa's clean energy transition and cemented Namibia as a continental hub for hydrogen and lithium refinement. Then came Zimbabwe, and the move that truly caught Washington off guard. In a single announcement, Harare banned all raw lithium exports. Global mining giant panicked, investors fled for a week. Then China stepped in. Within months, new refineries were under construction. Local jobs tripled, and Zimbabwe's lithium exports didn't stop, they simply changed form. Now, instead of selling dirt, Zimbabwe sells battery-grade lithium carbonate, processed, branded, and priced by Africans. That's when Washington realized this wasn't a rebellion, it was a restructuring. While the West debated sanctions, BRICS nations were busy rewriting trade. In 2025, South Africa led the charge to establish the BRICS Commodity Exchange, a new digital platform allowing member states to trade critical minerals in their own currencies, not the US dollar. For the first time, Africa could sell copper, cobalt, and gold directly to India, China, or Brazil without touching the dollar system. That single move sent a message across the Atlantic: Africa had found a financial escape hatch. Washington's response? Panic masked as diplomacy. Suddenly, American envoys flooded African capitals with proposals: partnership for prosperity, democracy and development deals, critical minerals frameworks, all promising mutual benefit. But African policymakers had learned to read between the lines. They knew mutual usually meant one-sided. So instead of saying yes, they said, "We'll think about it." And then they called Beijing, or New Delhi, or even Riyadh. Today, 5 African nations, Zambia, DRC, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique, are forming a strategic mineral alliance, backed quietly by India and the Way. Their mission: to coordinate prices, policies, and export controls, much like OPEC did with oil. If successful, this would give Africa a unified voice in global mineral pricing, a power the US has fought to prevent for decades. And this time, it's not theory, it's happening. Meanwhile, US corporations are facing a new reality. They can't simply buy access anymore. They must negotiate on Africa's terms. Companies like Tesla and General Motors are scrambling to secure lithium and cobalt deals. But now, African negotiators walk into the room with a simple phrase: "What are you offering us beyond money?" Because Africa's new currency isn't just minerals, it's control. And here's the part Washington fears most. As more African nations join BRICS trade systems, they're moving away from the dollar. The continent that once relied on US-backed trade routes is now trading in rupees, yuan, and local currencies. That's not just economic independence, that's geopolitical realignment. It means every ton of cobalt sold in Chinese yuan, every shipment of lithium priced in rupees, weakens the global dominance of the dollar just a little more. And when billions of dollars shift hands that way, even a little more becomes a seismic shift. The US isn't giving up quietly. In early 2025, the State Department announced new African economic re-engagement initiatives: billions in loans, special trade access, even talk of American-backed refineries. But the tone has changed. Gone is the arrogance of the old playbook. Now US officials arrive with offers, not orders, because for the first time Africa has options. As the world races toward green technology, Africa stands at the center of it all. The minerals buried beneath its soil are no longer symbols of exploitation, they read tickets to transformation. And the partnerships being formed today with BRICS nations, Middle Eastern investors, and African innovators are reshaping the global balance of power. The US might still be a superpower, but in the mineral world, Africa is the new architect. The truth is, Africa didn't win this war with weapons or wealth. It won with wisdom, the quiet kind that grows from history's lessons. Because after centuries of being controlled, Africa finally learned the greatest secret of all. Control doesn't come from what you have, it comes from what you refuse to give away. For centuries, maps were drawn from the north looking south because power flowed that way, but today those lines are being redrawn. Trade routes are reversing, old centers of wealth are bending toward new ones, and at the heart of that redirection stands a continent once described only as emerging. Now it's emerging in reverse, pulling others toward it. The world's hunger for clean energy has turned minerals into the new currency of power. Lithium is the new oil, cobalt the new steel, and copper the new bloodstream of digital life. A decade ago, the US set the rules for this market. Today, those rules are being written in African capitals. When Namibia raises export duties, stock markets in New York react. When Zambia pauses copper shipments, electric car production lines in Texas slow down. Power has changed hands quietly, molecule by molecule. The BRICS alliance, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, was once seen as a counterweight. Now, with Egypt, Ethiopia, and Nigeria joining discussions, it's transforming into BRICS Plus, a continental network of economies stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Within this alliance, Africa isn't a junior partner. It's the resource backbone that gives BRICS credibility. It offers the minerals, the market, and the youth to drive the next industrial surge. For Washington, this new alignment is more than competition, it's a reordering of the world's supply chains. Because BRICS Plus isn't just a trade club, it's a declaration. The era of single center power is over. Unlike the old Cold War alignments, Africa isn't choosing sides, it's writing its own playbook. It trades with China, but trains engineers with India. It signs refinery deals with the Way while negotiating digital corridors with Brazil. Every partnership is pragmatic, not ideological. This flexibility is what Western strategists can't decode. They expect alliances to be permanent. Africa treats them as projects, useful while they last, replaceable when they don't. That adaptability is power. Look closely at a nighttime satellite image. New clusters of light now bloom along Africa's coasts: Lagos, Mombasa, Lusaka, Addis Ababa. Each light is more than electricity. It's evidence of investment, manufacturing, and data centers. By 2030, Africa's combined GDP is projected to rival the EU's growth rate. By 2040, it could hold the world's largest workforce, and the key driver behind that rise isn't foreign aid or charity. It's resource control paired with industrial ambition. In the White House Situation Room, analysts now include African mineral indices next to oil prices and tech stocks, because whoever controls the flow of lithium, nickel, and cobalt controls the pace of innovation itself. That's why U.S. think tanks are quietly urging a new strategy. Instead of trying to contain Africa's partnerships, they argue for integration, shared manufacturing, transparent pricing, co-ownership. But even those proposals face one obstacle: trust. After decades of extractive politics, Africa's leaders are cautious. They remember every broken promise, every development loan that turned into debt. And so, the question echoing through Washington today isn't how do we lead Africa? It's how do we earn our way back in? From South America to Southeast Asia, nations are watching Africa's strategy and copying it. Indonesia banned raw nickel exports, Chile renegotiated lithium contracts, even Saudi Arabia is investing in African refineries instead of importing ore. This is no longer an African story, it's a global South awakening, a collective realization that value is created not by what you sell, but by where you refine it. And as this movement grows, the balance of global power slides southward toward the equator, toward Africa. But minerals are only half the story, the other half is cultural. Confidence. African filmmakers, economists, and journalists are reframing the narrative of the continent not as a victim of exploitation but as an architect of modernity. Social media movements, Pan-African universities, and digital startups are replacing dependency with identity. Power, after all, begins in perception, and Africa's perception of itself has changed forever. In the 20th century, globalization was about production moving to cheaper labor. In the 21st, it's about resources moving to smarter negotiators. Africa is no longer exporting cheap labor. It's exporting terms, and that's what makes this global shift irreversible. When a continent begins to decide how the world manufactures, trades, and powers itself, the map of power itself is rewritten. Washington once believed it could predict every economic trend, but what it didn't predict was the rise of collective intelligence, the ability of nations long divided to act with a single economic purpose. That purpose is visible today in every contract that demands local ownership, every refinery built on African soil, every deal signed in local currency. The global mineral war isn't ending with a winner or loser, it's ending with a balance, a new order where power is distributed, not dictated. This is more than history turning a page, it's history changing its author. The story of wealth and power no longer begins in Washington, London, or Beijing. It begins wherever Africans decide. It should, because the future is no longer imported. It's being mined, refined, and defined right here on African soil.